Hello, everyone. I'm Ben Parham, an Education Assistant at the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. I want to warmly welcome you to our summer webinar series. Today, we examine using processed glass aggregate in road and infrastructure projects. Next slide, please. Do you need professional credits? You can receive 1 hour professional development credit by participating in this live webinar and completing the short survey at the end. Our webinars are being recorded and will be made available for those who registered. Continue your learning with these webinars all summer long. Please visit our new website at nrrarecycles.org for additional information. Next slide. Here's some information on our webinars. For recycling facility operators, we have our operator track webinars from which to choose from. Next slide. And for our educators, administrators, and community members, we have our community track webinars. We've separated our webinars according to probable interest groups, but all NRRA members and not yet members are welcome to participate in any and all of our webinar offerings. Next slide. I'd like to set the table for this GoToWebinar. Webinar participants will not be able to be heard by the presenters or other participants during this presentation. If you cannot hear the presenters' voices, please click the audio arrow in your control panel and choose computer audio. If that does not work, select the phone call option and follow the directions. We hope that you will all ask questions and our presenters will do their best to answer them as time allows. Click on the question block in the control panel and type in your questions. Please keep questions short and to the point. Next slide, please. Here's some information about the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. We are a recycling nonprofit. We have 400 members, primarily municipalities, and we were founded nearly 40 years ago. Next slide. So what do? We do cooperative marketing and purchasing. We enable communities to manage their own recycling programs and offer over 40 programs, including single stream and municipal solid waste. We connect sellers of recyclables to purchasers. Next slide, please. We provide education and technical assistance through workshops, facility tours, an annual conference, a school club, and summer webinars. Next slide. And now I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Reagan Bissonnette is the Executive Director of the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. Reagan oversees all aspects of the NRRA's activities and speaks extensively on the subject of recycling markets in the Northeast. Madeleine DiIonno is a graduate student at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire. Thank you for joining us today, Reagan and Madeleine. On behalf of the NRRA, I'd like to welcome you to the summer webinar series and turn this presentation over to you.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, everyone. This is Reagan Bissonnette, and we are going to be talking about using processed glass aggregate in road and infrastructure projects. And we're glad to have you here with us today. As Ben said, I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Resource Recovery Association. And I feel like sometimes I spend half of my days talking about glass. It's really an issue that a lot of people want to learn more about. So we're glad to spend some time talking with you about it today. And I am joined by Madeleine DiIonno. Madeleine, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thank you, Reagan. Good morning, everyone. My name is Madeleine DiIonno, and as Ben mentioned, I am a graduate student at the Carsey School of Public Policy at the University of New Hampshire, and I've been volunteering with the NRRA over the past year.
So here's an agenda for where we'll be going today. We'll first talk about the process of creating processed glass aggregate and specifically NRRA's experience doing so. Then we'll talk about the frankly confusing different state specifications for PGA because it really varies by state and it also varies by state agency, which makes it a bit complicated. So you will hear us talking in some generalities about how PGA can be made, but really the devil's in the details when it comes to the different requirements by state, and we'll go over that. Then we'll talk a bit about the benefits of using processed glass aggregate. And then also NRRA recently completed a survey that Madeleine assisted with to collect specific examples of PGA use. And so we'll talk a bit about the survey results, and then we'll also discuss some very specific examples of when PGA has been used. And you will hear us using the abbreviation quite a bit. Processed glass aggregate is a mouthful, but basically we're talking about crushed glass here. So let's start with the process of creating processed glass aggregate. And I want to start with a little bit of background that some of you might be familiar with already, which is that markets for recycling glass are somewhat limited. We do offer two different programs for managing glass at NRRA. We have members participating in this program in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. And in New Hampshire, we don't have a bottle bill law. And so we don't actually have as pure of a supply of glass as is really necessary, coming out of New Hampshire at least, to be turning glass into new glass bottles and jars. And so we offer sort of the next best option for some of our members, which is collecting glass bottles and jars and turning those into fiberglass insulation. And just a snapshot of how that program works. It does allow only glass bottles and jars. We send glass from various municipalities up to a vendor in Canada, who then cleans and crushes and further processes that glass. Ultimately, that product comes back into the United States to be made into fiberglass insulation. And we have about 40 communities who are participating in that. But one of the challenges of participating in this particular glass recycling program is that the specifications are pretty tight. You really cannot have any glass-like contaminants included in this program. And so when I say glass-like contaminants, I'm referring to ceramic, porcelain, things like that that are increasingly finding their way into our glass streams. So the solution that we have to offer communities is our processed glass aggregate program. And this is actually a program that NRRA has been offering for decades in various forms. And so I'm going to talk about what that program looks like now and some of the things we've learned from this process. The high-level overview is that our processed glass aggregate program accepts glass bottles and jars from municipalities. And when we have enough aggregate collected at our host sites, which we'll talk more about, then we actually, once we have enough glass, then we crush it into this aggregate. And it can be used for a variety of road and infrastructure projects as a sub-base. And those uses do vary by state. And we have about 65 communities right now that are participating in this program in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. So first, in terms of talking about how we collect our glass, this is done at local transfer stations. So communities can collect their glass in a bunker, like you see here. They can collect it in a roll-off container, whatever makes the most sense for that community. And then the municipality is actually responsible for delivering glass to one of our host sites. And they can do that in a roll-off container, in a dump body trailer. Some take it with their local highway department dump truck. But it is a responsibility through our program for communities to bring their material to one of our host sites. And, you know, as we alluded to, different states have different levels of what they will accept in their processed glass aggregate. So the photo you see here was taken in New Hampshire, because in New Hampshire, you can have things like porcelain and Pyrex included in processed glass aggregate. So here you see that there are some toilets, broken up toilets, that were included in this particular photo. Now, there are certain materials that are never acceptable in processed glass aggregate, regardless of the state. And so I'm going to let you know which ones are always not allowed. So headlights, thermometers, light bulbs, all things that we know have materials that we wouldn't want to be crushed up. Windshield glass is problematic because it has that layer of, I believe it's a heavy duty layer of plastic in it so that the glass doesn't shatter. That's problematic for grinding up into processed glass aggregate. We also don't allow plexiglass. And then depending on the state, there are other things that are not allowed, but these are always unacceptable materials in processed glass aggregate. So we have 5 different host sites. So as I mentioned, when communities participate in our processed glass aggregate program, they're responsible for delivering their glass to one of our host sites. So we have 3 in New Hampshire, 1 in Vermont, and 1, our newest one, is on the Cape in Dennis, Massachusetts. And what you can see here is the number of communities that are served by each of these host sites. So you can see that our most active host sites are accepting material from 25 different communities, 1 in New London, New Hampshire, and 1 in Rochester, New Hampshire. And I'll note that 4 of these host sites are located at transfer stations or nearby on municipal land. And then 1 of these is actually located at a commercial landfill. So that's the Rochester, New Hampshire location. That's actually at the waste management turnkey facility. They're one of our host sites, but the rest of these are all municipalities that we're partnering with to actually be host sites. And one of the things we've learned about operating a processed glass aggregate program for so many years is what makes an ideal glass host site, because we're always looking to see if perhaps there is a new place that we could offer a host site, because of course glass is very heavy, and so it's expensive to transport. And so the more host sites we can offer to communities, the less expense they will incur in transporting that glass. So when we think about what makes an ideal glass host site and what would be a good spot for a future host site, ideally we're going to have a flat 1 acre area. And this is because you need space both to have trucks coming in to deposit the glass. You need to have that pile of glass. You need to have room for equipment to be maintaining the glass. And then when we actually bring in our mobile crushing unit, we need to have space for that heavy piece of machinery to be set up, and then for the glass to be moved from this pile into the machinery and then crushed and dumped into a new pile. So really a flat 1 acre area is a good amount of space. Ideally, a host site will have a truck scale. And so this is so you can weigh the loads of glass coming in, because as I'll discuss, we charge for this program based on the ton of glass. So we need to know how much glass is coming in. This one is really critical. You need to have at your host site staff who are willing to take the time to inspect every single load of glass coming in. We really need to know if there's unacceptable contamination coming in, because we have a process where we will provide a warning and then later actually charge a fee to a community that's bringing in unacceptable material, because we really need to make sure that the quality of this product meets state specifications. So a great host site is going to have a staff member who has the time and ability to inspect each load coming in, and then if there's a problem, take a photo or a few photos and then promptly notify us so that we can communicate back to the community that delivered that glass. And then lastly, a host site will need to have a front end loader or some other type of equipment so that they can maintain that pile and keep it pushed up. So here's a photo of our glass crusher. It is a retrofitted rock crusher, actually. And again, we work with a vendor who brings this from site to site. And this machinery involves a screen that actually will crush the material to an appropriate size. As I alluded to, the specifications for the size of the final product do vary by state. And so this machine is set up with a screen that will crush to 1 inch or less which is the specification in New Hampshire and Vermont. And then in other states, we actually have to crush it more finely, which requires running it through the crusher again. Now, I do want to point out that some communities crush with their own equipment. So there are certainly communities out there that have their own glass crushing equipment that they're using on site, and they're not participating directly in our program. And there are also some grants that are available to support that. So in New Hampshire, there's an organization called New Hampshire the Beautiful, and they provide grants to help communities purchase equipment to improve their recycling. And so one of the things that they have provided money for is for communities to purchase their own glass crusher. I know that in Massachusetts, there are also grants through the Department of Environmental Protection. And so I know of communities in Massachusetts that have also purchased glass crushers, in part using funds from that grant. So that's an option as well. Certainly we're not, the Northeast Resource Recovery Association is not the only place that is crushing glass. It's not unique to us, although it's something we've been doing for a long time. Now, this is a question that comes up quite a bit, which is that once you have this processed glass aggregate at the host site, who owns it? What happens with it? And the way our host sites work is that our hosts own the processed glass aggregate, and they may use it, they may give it away, or they may sell it. And I will say that right now, there is not as much of a market really for selling this processed glass aggregate, though we hope that that's something that will develop over time. So right now, historically, our hosts have been using the product themselves or giving it away, or both. There is also a take-back provision that we include in our agreements with our communities, so that if a host site has excess material and they either can't or don't want to use it all, and they can't find another entity that wants to take that processed glass aggregate, we actually have a provision where the contributing communities will need to take back sort of an equal amount, a proportional amount of glass that they had originally contributed to the pile. And this is not, I'm trying to think if this is something we've ever actually had to implement. To my knowledge, we haven't, but it is something that gives the host sites comfort knowing that they're not just going to take all this material, and then if they can't find a use for it, they're stuck with it. Now, in terms of how you can use processed glass aggregate, as I said, it varies by state, but in general, it can be used for a wide variety of construction projects. So it can be used under roads, it can be used under sidewalks, it can be used for foundations under buildings, it can be used for pipe bedding and landfill cover, and we'll go over some specific examples of how it's been used in that way. It is common for it to be mixed with gravel when using it in some of these projects, especially as a sub-base for roads and sidewalks and foundations. And in some cases, you can actually use up to 100% processed glass aggregate in some private municipal applications, like in New Hampshire, for example. And I will go over an example of that later. One key thing about processed glass aggregate, and this is sort of one of those myths, is that people get concerned that if you have crushed glass, it's going to concern residents who think it's going to, puncture their tires. The fact is that processed glass aggregate cannot be used uncovered. It has to be covered up. It can't be left on a surface. Even though it is crushed so finely that you can put your hands in it and not even cut your hands, but just to avoid any of those concerns, states do typically specify that you have to have processed glass aggregate underneath something else. You cannot leave it uncovered on the surface. So now I'm going to turn it over to Madeleine to talk about the state specifications for PGA. And, as I've been saying, they really do vary.
Great, thank you, Reagan. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. Great. So good morning, everyone. As Reagan mentioned, requirements for PGA use vary by state as well as state agency. As part of this webinar, we provided a chart that summarizes these specifications in detail, specifically for the states of New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. Maine and Rhode Island are also included, but they do not have specifications for PGA use. In this chart, you'll notice that each state is separated out by its Department of Transportation and Environmental Protection Agency. And there are different sets of rules regarding permitted uses and gradation for each. So each state and agency allows for glass food and beverage containers to be used for PGA. Some allow other glass-like materials, such as Pyrex and ceramics, up to a certain percentage of the overall batch of PGA. Again, this depends on the state as well as the state agency. Each also has varying allowances for certain types of contaminants. For the most part, across all 4 states in this chart, no more than 1% of the PGA batch can have contaminants such as screw tops or plastic cap rings. Each state and agency also outlines different allowable uses for the PGA. Across the board, sub-base material for roads and structural fill are the most common allowable uses for PGA. But as I mentioned, the chart goes into much greater detail on all of the allowable uses for PGA, separated out by state and state agency. Next slide, please. So one of the key differences to know among each of the states in this chart is their gradation requirements. Overall, all PGA must be crushed into pieces that are either 1 inch or 3/8 of an inch or less in size, and this depends on the state. As you can see here, in Massachusetts, PGA must be crushed to 3/8 of an inch or less, and in Vermont, the specification is 1 inch or less. And this is both for the state's Departments of Transportation and Environmental Protection agencies. New Hampshire and Connecticut are a little bit different in that there are different size requirements between their Departments of Transportation and Environmental Services. So in New Hampshire, the Department of Environmental Services specifies that PGA must be crushed into pieces that are 1 inch or less to be used in municipal construction projects, whereas the New Hampshire Department of Transportation requires it to be crushed to 3/8 of an inch or less to be used in state projects. Connecticut has a similar scenario, except that the DOT has different size specifications depending on the use of the material. Next slide, please. So I'll just note the challenge with the 3/8 of an inch or less specification is that crushing the material that finely takes more time and costs more money. So all PGA host sites managed by the NRRA in New Hampshire and Vermont crush the glass to the 1 inch specification. But this means that the available PGA in New Hampshire is not eligible for state projects because it does not meet the DOT specification of 3/8 of an inch or less. However, at the NRRA's host site in Dennis, Massachusetts, the PGA is crushed to 3/8 of an inch minus in accordance with the Massachusetts specifications. But again, crushing to this standard costs the NRRA more money, which is then borne by the communities participating in this program in Massachusetts. Next slide. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Reagan for questions.
Thanks, Madeleine. So everyone, we're roughly halfway through our presentation, so we wanted to pause and see if people had questions. And while I'm waiting for people to put things through the chat, I will note that the handout, that chart that Madeleine was referencing, it's one of the downloads available in the handout section in the control panel. So you can pull that up and look through that at your leisure. It's quite detailed, which is why we didn't want to try and cram it onto a screen here and walk you through every fine detail. But I think suffice it to say that one of the takeaways that we've had as we've really looked at the different states is that unfortunately every single state is doing their own thing. And while there are some similarities, I will say that it took a considerable amount of time and research and communicating with different state agencies simply to put together the chart that is that handout, because the states are not consistent, which does make it difficult if you, for example, have a community in New Hampshire that wishes to use processed glass aggregate. And it just so happens that that community is closest to the Massachusetts border, and perhaps they wanted to get some PGA from Massachusetts. Well, the specifications might not match up. And that's something that we've run into before. Now, I did see that we had a question come in earlier that was asking, are there currently any available projects seeking PGA? So yes, there are. And what I can say is that I've had a number of different requests come in, typically from private contractors who are responding to a municipality's request for proposals to bid on a construction project. So largely the desire to see PGA be used has been driven by municipalities who are saying, for example, on the Cape, I know there's a community on the Cape in Massachusetts who needs to do a massive sewer line replacement project. And that community wanted to have whoever bid on the project use processed glass aggregate as pipe bedding for that project. Now, we're sort of in a chicken and the egg problem because it just so happens that the quantity of glass that was needed for that project was huge, and it was more than all of the processed glass aggregate than we had at all of our host sites at the time in New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. So in that particular case, I don't believe they're going to be able to use any bedding, any PGA for that pipe bedding. And then I see we had another question come in that sort of ties into what I'm talking about right now, which is the question is, I'm curious, what is the demand for PGA? Is the demand sufficiently supplied by what's currently available? So I did just sort of answer that question, but to elaborate, yes, there is demand, but what we found is that there are many municipalities who have used this product and have been very happy with it, and they've used it mostly in local municipal road and infrastructure projects. What we have not seen is state Department of Transportation agencies using processed glass aggregate. I think part of the reason for that is because, as I mentioned, you would need a vast quantity of processed glass aggregate for it to be worthwhile for a state, for example, to use it in a highway project. And we don't have that volume of quantity. So we have seen people requesting to use processed glass aggregate, and sometimes we don't have enough available. And then in other cases, we might feel like we've got too much available at a host site and are struggling to find someone who locally who can use it. So one of the reasons, frankly, that we're holding this webinar and that we put together this chart is that we want to spread the word about processed glass aggregate so that more people are familiar with this as an option for local reuse of glass. And then I see a question came in, is there any evidence that the ceramics or porcelain would be detrimental to PGA? And follow-up, are there contamination concerns for storage or use? So we have not seen any evidence that ceramics or porcelain are problematic with processed glass aggregate. We have many communities in New Hampshire and Vermont that have included porcelain and ceramics in their processed glass aggregate without any problems. Now, that being said, usually the vast majority of the product still is glass. That ceramic and porcelain is usually a pretty small percentage of the overall product. And then in terms of, are there contamination concerns for storage or use? Not that we've run into. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a bit, but processed glass aggregate can be stored outside, uncovered. And one of the great things about glass is that glass is inert. And so it's not leaching anything into the soil when you bury it, unlike some other products that might be reused. So not seeing any more questions at this time, I'm going to go ahead and move on, and we will have an amount of time at the end for questions as well. So please do feel free to keep submitting those and we'll answer more at the end. So here I'll talk briefly about the benefits of using processed glass aggregate. So there's three big categories of benefits for using processed glass aggregate. And the first one, of course, is environmental benefits. So using PGA is a great alternative to landfilling this material, glass. Now, of course, that only applies in communities states where you can landfill glass. So in Vermont, for example, in New Hampshire, for example, we do not have a ban on landfilling recyclables, nor do we have a mandate to recycle. So in New Hampshire, this is certainly a benefit that's relevant, which is that if we can keep glass out of a landfill, that's a good thing. In all cases, using glass locally, bringing it to a nearby host site, reduces transportation emissions and costs of transporting glass to what is becoming increasingly distant markets in some cases. And this is one thing that maybe everyone isn't aware of, but there's actually a shortage of sand in the world. And that might seem kind of strange because, of course, there's lots of sand in the world, but it turns out that the particular type of sand that is used for construction, used for concrete, used for making new glass, that particular type of sand, there's actually a shortage of it, especially as we see populations continue to increase around the world. And so one of the benefits of using processed glass aggregate is that you're reducing sand and gravel extraction that would have to take place in order to use sand and gravel if you were not using processed glass aggregate. And then the last one, as I already mentioned, glass is inert. And so a great thing is that it does not erode or leach contaminants into the soil. So the second category of benefits that I like to think about with processed glass aggregate is the physical benefits. So one great thing is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers studied processed glass aggregate years ago, and they concluded that it is not frost susceptible, meaning that glass does not absorb water. So it's actually great for using in areas where we get frost heaves like we do in some of the silty soft soils in New Hampshire. So we have a number of communities that have used processed glass aggregate underneath their roads and sidewalks and have been really happy that it seems to withstand frost susceptibility. Also, ease of compaction. We've received a lot of feedback from those who've used PGA are really happy with how it compacts, including some who were concerned that it would not pack as well as other natural aggregates. And then again, because glass does not absorb water, you can store processed glass aggregate, the finished product, you can store it uncovered outdoors and it's not going to freeze like a pile of sand would. And as I mentioned earlier, when you properly crush PGA, it's smooth and it has no sharp or jagged edges. So you can stick your hands in it and not worry about cutting yourself. That's sort of another myth out there that people seem to think it would not be a safe product to handle. And then last but definitely not least, the financial benefits of PGA are huge. And honestly, even though the physical benefits are great and the environmental benefits are great, money talks. And this is a huge driver. The financial benefit is a huge driver of why we see communities so interested in participating in our processed glass aggregate program. So as we all know, glass is heavy, and that makes it expensive to transport it. It makes it expensive to throw it away in states like New Hampshire where you can throw it away. And so using processed glass aggregate can really become a valuable cost avoidance strategy for communities. So one example I'll give you is that the community of Stratford, Vermont was paying $121 a ton for their dual stream recycling. And then they pulled out their glass and actually got a financial benefit for doing so from the materials recovery facility they were sending their recyclables to. They were able to pull out their glass and pay just $40 to send it to one of NRRA's host sites. So that's a huge savings to go from $121 a ton to $40 a ton for glass. And then also there's the added benefit of communities being able to save money by not buying gravel and sand if they're actually using the processed glass aggregate themselves in their local projects. So I'll turn this back over to Madeleine to talk about the results of our process glass aggregate survey.
Great, thank you. So you can go to the next slide, please. So to collect examples of PGA use throughout the Northeast, we launched a survey that asked participants to describe the types of projects where they've used PGA, as well as their overall experience using the material. Our survey was launched on June 1st, and we had a total of 16 professionals from public works departments, as well as private contracting companies provide feedback from New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Jersey. Next slide. So one of the first questions we asked was about the nature of the project where the PGA was used. Specifically, we wanted to know if the project was a municipal, state, or private project. As you can see here, the majority of responses we received indicated that the PGA was used in a municipal project, as well as a few private projects. We actually had no responses for PGA use in a state project. Next slide. We then asked about the type of projects the PGA was used for. Respondents were allowed to choose more than one answer here, and as you can see, for the most part, the most common applications for PGA among the survey respondents were bedding material for pipes, walls, or foundations, drainage, sub-base material for roadway, and utility trench bedding or backfill. A few people indicated that PGA was used as a sub-base material for trails or sidewalks, landfill cover, as well as sub-base for concrete slabs and parking lots. We had no responses for PGA use as filter media for wastewater treatment systems or as a bulking agent for compost. Other applications that were noted were the use of PGA under a trailhead kiosk, a park bench, and a picnic table platform, which we'll discuss as a specific example later on. Next slide, please. We also asked respondents to indicate their level of satisfaction with the end result after using this material. As you can see here, the overwhelming majority indicated that they were very satisfied with the overall use of PGA. I'll just note that those that indicated somewhat dissatisfied noted that their glass wasn't crushed properly for the application and did pose a safety hazard for workers. Next slide, please. And then I thought I'd share just some of the comments we received in the survey. Overall, we had very positive feedback on the use of PGA. So reading from top to bottom here, the glass saved us money and also had a great compaction factor being mixed with the crushed gravel. Good material to use, is not frost susceptible, and can be compacted easily. PGA was used under a sidewalk and has held up very well with no frost movement. And last, PGA is a terrific material and should be used in place of virgin materials. Next slide. And I'll turn it back over to Reagan to discuss some more specific examples of PGA use.
Great, thank you. So pulling a few examples out of that survey, we wanted to share a few specific ones with you. So the community of New London in New Hampshire, they've been a champion of process glass aggregate over the years. So I'm going to share a few examples that they have done. They have used process glass aggregate as a road sub-base. And here's some photos that they provided of that process for one particular road in their community. They have also used process glass aggregate under the garage floor for their public works garage under the base. And so they have some photos here showing laying down the process glass aggregate and then compacting it. And then they also used process glass aggregate as the base of their parking lot for one of their town buildings. And some of the feedback that they gave in the survey, and I'll say we will be publishing the survey results soon so that people can look at those as well. And so we'll make sure we send that to you all when that is ready. But some of the feedback that New London had for using process glass aggregate in these projects was that they were very satisfied. And one particular thing they pointed out is that in all of these projects, it seems to hold up really well with frost conditions. And the projects I just shared with you, these ones were done between 1992 and 2018. So they really have had in New London the experience of using processed glass aggregate for decades and seeing how it holds up long term, because of course that's a consideration as well, as you really want to make sure this product is going to last you long term. Another community that has used processed glass aggregate is Lee, New Hampshire. And here's an example where they used processed glass aggregate as the foundation under their bulky waste building. So we've got a sort of before and after here of the foundation. And then similarly, they have used processed glass aggregate in the foundation under where they keep their open top dumpsters. And they've also been quite happy with how this has worked as well. And then the last example I wanted to give is a bit of a different example. This is actually one of the more unusual examples we received. As I said, mostly we're seeing municipal use of processed glass aggregate. But here's a great example of how processed glass aggregate can be used in recreation projects. So Parsons Marsh Trail is in Massachusetts, and it is a fully accessible trail that is managed by the Berkshire Natural Resources Council. It was constructed in 2018, so this is relatively new. And processed glass aggregate was used under the kiosk that you see here, also under a bench, and under a fully accessible picnic table. And what's interesting is that in all of these cases, the processed glass aggregate was put underneath a base called EcoMat. It's a matting that's made of recycled single-use plastics. So what was neat about this project is it was also done in a really environmentally sustainable manner. And now we are ready to take some more questions, and I've seen some more coming in. So we will go through those, and please submit any more that you may have. Let's see. So someone asks, is processed glass aggregate the same as glass pozzolan? So I have to admit, I don't know as much about glass pozzolan as I would like, and it's something I need to learn more about. And actually, I'll be learning about that at a glass forum that I'll be speaking at in a few months that's being offered by the Northeast Recycling Council. But my understanding is that pozzolan, it's a term that's given to material that when you combine it with cement and water, forms sort of an ultra strong concrete. So my guess here, and perhaps even someone can chime in on the chat to who knows more about this, my guess is that that particular product is ground much more finely than processed glass aggregate tends to be ground. It is possible to grind glass into a very fine sand-like substance. That's not something that we have experience with at NRRA, really because, as Madeleine mentioned, it costs quite a bit more money to crush that finely using our equipment. But I know that that is an option as well. In fact, some communities have ground glass into a sand-like substance and then used that to actually replace sand on beaches that are eroding. Another question came in saying, glass bottles can be disinfected and reused. Why are we not asking the originating businesses to actually take the bottles back, as in beer or soda? My honey guy reuses them. It is done in Europe. So I agree with you there. I mean, there are certainly a lot of benefits of simply reusing glass. And I know that at my local grocery store, I can buy milk in a reusable glass and then take it back to my grocery store. And that's my preference when that option is out there. I think, quite frankly, that it's a matter of convenience. We have developed more of a culture in the United States where it's more convenient for people to put the glass into their recycling bin than to send it back to the store to get cleaned. So there are instances of that, but I guess there's just not as much of a market for it. That would be ideal, is to actually reuse the glass. And as I mentioned, the next best option would be actually taking glass bottles and turning them into new glass bottles. And we're traditionally only seeing that happen in states that have a bottle bill, because in order to create brand new glass bottles and jars, you need an extremely pure supply of just glass. Because if you end up getting a little bit of ceramic or Pyrex into that supply, your new glass bottle or jar is going to have a small imperfection in it, because the melting point for that ceramic is higher. And so when you melt glass to make new glass, that little bit of ceramic is not going to melt, and it's going to create an imperfection in the resulting glass bottle. And then if you carbonate that glass bottle, as you can imagine, it might explode. So it just requires a very high standard to actually be recycling glass into new glass bottles and jars. Now, I see a question came in. Who do we reach out to if we want the product for use in town projects? Well, I would suggest starting out, reaching out to me, and then what I can do is direct you to the closest processed glass aggregate host site that would be available and has material available. So that is pretty common. I have people who will email me asking if we have product. You know, NRRA does not actually own the product, but then I can direct you to the host site that has material available that could be used. And as I said, I would need to know what state are you wanting to use this in and what type of project, because then I can tell you where we have processed glass aggregate that is crushed to meet those specifications. And let's see, so, we had one more question come in, and this one says, when considering contamination, is the percentage based on weight or volume? Yes, this is an important question. So if you look at that very detailed but wonderfully summarized handout that we've provided, what you'll see is that a number of the states, they make it very clear that they have contamination limits that are based on volume. And that is typically because much of the contamination that we might see coming into our processed glass aggregate stream, it's often going to be light things like plastic, screw caps, paper. And so if you did that by weight, you would be allowing quite a bit more contamination in. And so as I'm just skimming through the handout, I see that I believe all of the contamination limits are based on volume. And I think that is all the questions I have seen come in. If there are any more, now is a great time. Otherwise, we will move along and wrap up. So I'll watch for anything else coming in. I will go ahead and acknowledge that the information that we're sharing today was supported in part by a grant from the Rural Utilities Service with the United States Department of Agriculture. And so we appreciate their support to help promote glass recycling throughout the Northeast. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning. It was great to have you with us and to learn more about processed glass aggregate. I do want to note that on our website, which is nrrarecycles.org, we have a resource library with an entire section devoted to glass recycling. So there's more information there. And we also will have 2 additional resources that will be coming out this fall that we're pretty excited about. One is that decades ago, the Northeast Resource Recovery Association worked with New Hampshire the Beautiful to create a video about using processed glass aggregate. And we are actually filming a new updated version of that video this fall. So I hope that that will be available for you all sometime in September or October. And it will just be a brief, perhaps a 5-6 minute video highlighting how processed glass aggregate is made and the benefits of using it. And then we're also working on an ArcGIS story map. And this will essentially be an interactive, visually appealing map that will show all of our host locations, both for our processed glass aggregate and for our glass program where we recycle glass into fiberglass. And that will show all the different communities that are participating in these programs. It'll enable people to easily see where is the nearest host site to them. So stay tuned for that as well in the fall.
Well, Reagan, I'll interject here. Thank you so much, both Reagan and Madeleine, for that wonderful presentation. I certainly learned a lot about PGA today. We do want to make sure that we recognize and thank our sponsors for today, the Interstate Refrigerant Recovery Incorporated, Schnitzer, and the USDA. I'd also like to remind everyone that there is a post-webinar survey that will launch immediately after this webinar. It will also appear in your email inbox tomorrow. As a reminder, we welcome all feedback. Next slide, please. Our webinar series will continue later this week on Friday when Cindy Sterling, Senior Educator and Grant Manager with the NRRA, will share with us the messy truth about students and their garbage. Then, next Wednesday on August 5th, we will hear about legislative updates in Massachusetts and Vermont with Josh Kelly from the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation and Ariella Lovett, a legislative analyst with the Mass Municipal Association. Thank you all for attending and have a happy summer.